On October 27, 1962, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world may have come closer to nuclear war beneath the Atlantic than in any presidential meeting room. A Soviet submarine called B-59 was moving near the American quarantine line around Cuba, cut off from Moscow, surrounded by U.S. warships, and carrying a weapon the Americans did not know existed, a nuclear torpedo. Inside the submarine, the air was worsening, the batteries were running low, and the crew had spent days underwater in suffocating heat. Above them, American destroyers began dropping small practice depth charges intended as signals to force the submarine to surface. But B-59 could not receive those signals clearly. To the men sealed inside, the explosions did not sound like a warning. They sounded like the opening shots of World War III. For the men inside, there was no map, no speech, and no certainty that anyone above them understood their danger. The crisis had begun because Soviet missiles were being installed in Cuba, only about 90 miles from Florida. American U-2 reconnaissance flights photographed the sites in October, and President John F. Kennedy responded with a naval quarantine designed to stop additional Soviet weapons from reaching the island. The public saw speeches, maps, and photographs. What it did not see was the underwater mission already moving toward the Caribbean. 4 Soviet Foxtrot-class diesel submarines had departed from the Kola Peninsula, and each carried 1 nuclear-armed torpedo. Their commanders had been given extraordinary authority if they were attacked. The United States Navy knew Soviet submarines might be near the blockade, but it did not know these relatively small diesel boats carried nuclear weapons. That gap in knowledge made every decision above the water more dangerous. The operation was secret, and every side saw only part of the danger. B-59 was built for a different kind of conflict. It was a diesel-electric submarine, which meant it needed to surface or use a snorkel regularly to recharge its batteries and refresh its air. During a naval hunt, that weakness became a trap. American ships could track it. Surfacing could expose it. The boat remained submerged for long periods, and conditions inside deteriorated sharply. Heat, carbon dioxide, fatigue, and fear made calm judgment harder. Messages from Moscow were unavailable or incomplete, so Captain Valentin Savitsky had no reliable way to know whether the political crisis was still a confrontation or had already turned into a shooting war. His crew were not simply hiding from ships. They were trapped in a metal tube with a nuclear weapon aboard, trying to interpret explosions in the dark. Every minute underwater made panic more tempting than proof. The American destroyers did not intend to sink B-59 that day. U.S. forces used small signaling depth charges. An agreed method meant to tell a submerged submarine that it had been detected and should surface for identification. Yet an action that seemed controlled to one side could look terrifying to the other. The Soviet crew had been isolated, exhausted, and unable to follow events above the water. They could hear blasts against the hull, but could not know whether heavier weapons would follow. This is the part of the story that makes it so frightening. Nobody needed to want nuclear war. Nobody needed to give a direct order to start one. Miscommunication, physical stress, and a few explosions could create a situation where men believed that war had already begun and that waiting might mean dying without fighting back. It was a perfect example of a warning becoming dangerous when its meaning was unknown. Captain Savitsky reportedly concluded that the United States might be attacking and ordered the nuclear torpedo prepared. The weapon was not symbolic. It carried a nuclear warhead with destructive power comparable to the Hiroshima bomb, and firing it at the American ships could have killed sailors instantly while forcing Washington to decide whether the strike had come from the Soviet Union itself. In the tense logic of 1962, retaliation could have escalated within hours. The crucial detail was that B-59 did not rely on one man's decision alone. 3 senior officers had to agree before the torpedo could be used. Savitsky supported firing. Political officer Ivan Maslenikov also supported it. The final voice belonged to Vasily Arkhipov, the flotilla chief of staff who happened to be aboard B-59 during this extraordinary confrontation. In that cramped compartment, catastrophe depended on a few exhausted officers. Arkhipov did not have a magical way to contact Moscow, and he could not prove that the Americans were harmless. What he did have was the discipline to question a conclusion everyone around him was beginning to accept. Rather than approve the launch, he argued with Savitsky and pushed for the submarine to surface. This was not a cinematic speech delivered in perfect silence. It was an argument inside an overheated vessel, among officers who were tired, frightened, and under pressure from unseen ships above them. But Archipov's refusal mattered because the procedure required agreement. His decision helped stop the nuclear torpedo from being fired. B-59 surfaced and the confrontation ended without a nuclear blast. The world outside did not celebrate, because almost nobody knew how close the incident had come to becoming a catastrophe. His refusal created time for reason to return. It was a choice with no safe answer. The submarine's appearance on the surface was humiliating for its crew, but it was also a relief. American sailors could see the vessel, while the Soviets could finally understand that the destroyers had not launched a full attack. The United States had forced B-59 to reveal itself without realizing that it had just faced a nuclear weapon at close range. For decades, this underwater episode remained largely unknown to the public. The Cuban Missile Crisis was remembered through Kennedy, Khrushchev, missile photographs, and the dramatic negotiations between two superpowers. Then later testimony, documents, and conferences revealed the story of the Soviet submarines. Historians learned that the danger was not limited to the missiles on Cuban soil. It also existed in an overheated submarine, where imperfect information turned ordinary naval pressure into a possible nuclear decision. The same day was already known as Black Saturday, the most dangerous point of the entire crisis. On October 27th, a US U-2 aircraft was shot down over Cuba, and American leaders debated military responses while negotiations with Moscow continued. Kennedy and Khrushchev were trying to avoid a disaster, but neither leader controlled every aircraft, ship, submarine commander, or nervous soldier involved in the confrontation. That is why the B-59 incident matters beyond its dramatic details. Nuclear crises are not managed by two people moving pieces on a chessboard. They are lived by thousands of people operating damaged equipment, interpreting partial orders, and making choices under pressure. A strategy can be careful at the top and still become dangerous at the edge, where a crew hears explosions and has seconds to decide what they mean. Its worst outcome could have begun with a misunderstanding between a few men. The broader crisis ended after 13 days. The Soviet Union agreed to remove its missile sites from Cuba, while the United States publicly promised not to invade the island. In a separate arrangement that stayed secret for years, Washington also agreed to remove US Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The agreement prevented immediate war, but it did not erase the fear created by October 1962. Both sides continued expanding their arsenals, and the Cold War lasted for decades. Still, the crisis changed how leaders thought about communication. A direct hotline between Washington and Moscow was established soon afterward, because relying on delayed diplomatic cables during a nuclear emergency had proved dangerously inadequate. The lesson was brutal. Peace can depend not only on strength, but on whether rivals can understand each other before fear fills the silence. The goal: make sure misunderstanding could not outrun diplomacy again. Vasily Arkhipov did not become a global celebrity after that night. His role was unknown to most people for many years, and even the details of the incident became clearer only after Soviet-era secrecy weakened and participants spoke publicly. That delay is important. Some of history's most consequential decisions are not made on television or recorded in famous speeches. They happen in places where nobody is watching: a control room, a border post, or in this case, a submarine beneath a hostile sea. Archipov's significance was not that he solved the Cuban Missile Crisis by himself. The crisis ended through diplomacy and compromise. His importance is that during one isolated moment when the system could have collapsed, he helped prevent a local naval encounter from becoming the first nuclear strike of a global war. Restraint can be as important as action, even if nobody knows it for decades. It would be too simple to say that one man definitely saved the entire world, because history does not work like a movie, and no one can calculate every possible consequence. But the established facts are alarming enough. B-59 carried a nuclear torpedo. American forces did not know it was there. Its captain came close to using it on the crisis's most dangerous day, and Arkhipov helped persuade him not to. Even a single nuclear detonation against U.S. naval forces could have triggered an unpredictable chain of military and political responses. The story is terrifying precisely because it was not an invasion, an intentional launch, or a grand plan. It was confusion. It was heat, isolation, and mistrust, and it happened at a time when both superpowers had enough weapons to turn one terrible misunderstanding into a disaster for millions. The margin between survival and catastrophe was a fragile human judgment. The real lesson of B-59 is not that humanity can always depend on a hero appearing at the final second. It is that systems built around fear and nuclear weapons leave too much to chance. In October 1962, diplomacy eventually succeeded because both Kennedy and Khrushchev accepted compromise instead of demanding total victory. Under the water, Arkhipov and Savitsky chose to surface instead of fire. Those choices did not make the Cold War safe, but they kept a terrifying moment from becoming irreversible. When people remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, they usually picture missiles in Cuba and leaders in Washington and Moscow. But one of its most important moments happened in darkness, inside a Soviet submarine, where the future of the world may have depended on one officer asking a question that everyone else was too frightened to ask. Are we absolutely sure this is war? During Cold War, this was the hardest question anyone could ask.